Good afternoon. Hopefully you can all see and hear me okay. My name is Tim Flagg and I'm going to be the host for today's webinar. Today's webinar is the Apprenticeships Levy. Are you ready? So, first of all, I'd like to now introduce our two speakers. We have Jason Moss, who is the CEO of Arch Apprentices, and we also have Ben Rowland, who is the Corporate Account Director for Arch Apprentices as well. I'd like to hand over to Ben, who'll be telling us a little bit more about Arch and what Arch does. Ben.
Thanks very much, Tim. Hello, everyone. As Tim said, my name's Ben Rowland. Along with two of the partners here at the Learn Charter Group, I started Arch 4 and a bit years ago, and since then we've had a large number of fantastic young people come through the programme, mainly new hires into businesses, but also businesses putting some of their existing staff onto our apprenticeship programmes all around digital and IT. I guess what's important from all that is that we actually, Tim, can go on to the next slide, we started life as the in-house programme for the Blenheim Charter Group, so I guess we've been on a similar journey to that which lots of you are on or about to embark on, which is figuring out how you build a programme that can tap into a pool of talent that has traditionally not been tapped into, and use programs for existing employees to skill them up and get them to a level of productivity that's great for them, as well as being great for you. So we've kind of been on that journey. I guess a key date in the diary of our history was at the start of this year when Ofsted came in to inspect us, and we were delighted that they judged us outstanding in all areas. So we kind of feel like we've made a good start on our journey. And as part of that journey, we also were asked by government to develop a new digital marketing apprenticeship, because one didn't exist beforehand, and that brought us into contact with other employers as well. So actually we've been delivering apprenticeships for lots of other employers as well along the way, which gives us an understanding of both what it's like to be a training provider ourselves, but also what it's like to be an employer going on this journey as well. In fact, we have 3 things that we work with people on, other employers. One is the apprenticeship program, which is the most long-standing of our programs. But we also launched earlier this year a graduate program, and we also have a levy service which helps employers who want us to kind of manage the whole kit and caboodle when it comes to running an apprenticeship program. So those are the 3 things that we deliver. And you'll see on the next slide, and Tim, that these are the kind of companies who we work with, and we're in conversation right now with pretty much all of these people and many others about how they can set up their program to best effect. I wanted to say, next one please, thanks Tim. Those of you who have got apprentices and are using apprenticeships already will know this, that apprenticeships are changing, probably the single biggest program of reform for this for vocational training that there's ever been. And Jason's going to talk in detail about the funding, the levy, which is what you guys have all kind of come to hear about, I guess. But it's important to know that there are other things that are changing as well in apprenticeships. One is the introduction of new apprenticeship programs. So the old apprenticeship frameworks, which is what people are probably using now, are being phased out by the government, and in their place are coming in apprenticeship standards. The big difference being that standards are only approved if they've been worked on by a group of at least 10 employers. So this is the opportunity the government has given to employers to say, well, if you don't like the programs that are on offer, you can go away and create your own. And here at Arch, we're heavily involved in a number of new programs in digital media, technology and IT, including degree level apprenticeships. The other thing that is changing is around eligibility. So in the past, it's always been the case that people could only get apprenticeship funding if they don't already have a degree. Well, in the new world, that's changing. People who have a degree can go on an apprenticeship program that's fundable by the levy, as long as the training is for new skills that they have, that they require in order to fulfill their job. So that's a really big change alongside the funding. And what it means is that apprenticeships as a program, as a tool for people in HR and L&D has become actually now really powerful and attractive. So we're encouraging people not to think of this as how do we kind of somehow reverse existing training and existing hires into an apprenticeship program, but rather think of the apprenticeship program as a a really exciting way of adding real structure and rigour to all of your CPD programs. Our view is that if you were to start with a blank sheet of paper and say, how am I going to design a program for someone to, in the first few years of their career, it would involve something like some off-the-job training, some off-the-job sessions to give inspiration, an insight and technical instruction, working in a cohort that would move through the year together so they could support each other, and of course taking that learning onto the job where they'd be encouraged to reflect and think about what they've learned, and vice versa, taking what they're learning on the job back into the training off the job and reflecting on that, working on tasks together as a really rich way of learning and developing as a young person. Well, that's what an apprenticeship program is. So rather than thinking of it as, oh, it's a burden, I've got to try and somehow get the most out of it and minimise the damage, actually we think this is a fantastic opportunity for employers to really turbocharge their CPD programs, not just for new hires, not just for their grad program, but for people who are being hired into the business as usual hires, and also for existing employees who need to be upskilled. So we're really excited on behalf of, along with our clients who we're working with, and getting a real sense of energy about it. But I do appreciate that there are lots of nuts and bolts questions and scratching of heads around the actual levy itself, and to that return to Jason to explain all.
Just before we get into Jason, just a quick question there, Ben. It strikes me that we've almost been exploring and testing what apprenticeships can do as a country, and the government introduced apprenticeships, and now this is the point at which they're saying we want to scale this. We want to ensure that the entire country are using apprenticeships, and the way we're going to do that is by putting in place this levy. So rather than seeing it as a piece of regulation, it's actually a big opportunity that the government's trying to bring business into a conversation. Yeah. Could you expand maybe a little bit on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's certainly the thinking behind the levy, as we understand it, was British companies, UK PLC collectively, on the one hand, consistently saying there aren't enough skills. And I'm sure HR and L&D folk on the webinar will have been having internal conversations for years about how more investment is required in skills in the company. But at the same time, British companies, compared to OECD peers, are not investing in skills. So there's this mismatch. Our view from talking to people is that a big reason why people want skills but don't invest in it is that real fear of competitors free riding on their investment. So spending money on training, spending time and effort on training people up, only for their competitors to pinch them with higher salaries because they've got more money because they haven't invested in training. So the government's response to that has been to say, well look, everyone is going to invest in training. It's just up to them whether they use it for themselves or not. Yeah. Certainly all large employers are going to invest in training. So that's the kind of the philosophy behind it. I think also over the last 5 or 10 years there's been a gradual recognition in government that actually of all the training programs that they've funded and supported, apprenticeships, this model of this really rich interplay between on the job and off the job, that's the hallmark of an apprenticeship, is the best way for people to develop skills and for the country's productivity to improve. And so I think they've kind of fixed on that as the model for doing it, and that's why they've introduced the levy as they have.
Great. Well, thank you for expanding on that. I think a perfect segue into finding out more about how the apprentice levy is actually going to work. So, Jason, to you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Tim, Ben, and afternoon, everyone. What I thought I'd do to start with, if it's okay, is just a brief recap on where we are with the levy. I guess for some of you on the call, or most of you on the call, I'd like to think that by now you understand a little bit about it. But we do still find on occasion when we go and see customers that actually this is new news to them, and therefore we don't want to assume that you all know about it already. So we'll just start off with that first. So the very first slide here talks about what it is, which we know it's essentially a new tax, a hypothecated tax that will come in next year, the new tax year, April the 6th, 2017. Who will pay it? Well, it'll be essentially companies with a pay bill which is greater than £3 million per year. And how will it be calculated? Well, the government will help with us calculate 0.5% of that pay bill, which would essentially be the annual amount you will be paying into the levy pot. I'll talk a little bit more about how that's going to work in a moment. So really that's kind of the recap. There's a small example here of a company where the pay bill is £50 million a year. That's essentially 0.5% of that would be £250,000. There's an allowance, and the reason for this allowance is £15,000 allowance effectively is to make it so that only companies of a certain size end up actually paying the levy. And there are more examples I'll show you later. But effectively, if your pay bill is less than 3 million, if you were to times that by 0.5%, it would come to less than 15,000, which are the companies that will be excluded from the levy payment and won't actually have to pay into the pot at all. So in this particular example, the pay bill, okay, £250,000 minus the 15,000 allowance, 235,000 will be paid into the levy account. Okay. So in England, there is going to be a top-up. So again, a little bit more detail came out about that in August. There will be a 10% top-up on your English portion of your payment into that pot. And again, I've got an example of that for you later. But as your payments go into your account each month, in addition to your payment going in, an additional 10% will also be paid into that account from the government, but on your English pay bill only, whereas the actual levy calculation is based on your UK payroll. And I think from the conversations that Ben and I have often when we're out with customers, often that's one of the first mistakes customers make, in fact, is they calculated it on the English portion of their pay bill and not their UK portion. So it will include, obviously, colleagues in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland as well. It's the total UK pay bill that's affected. So essentially there will be a new system set up called the Digital Apprenticeship Service. That's being set up as we speak. I've already seen some initial views of that. So there's effectively a number of us that were invited into Coventry to have a look at the new system, see how it's going to look, how it's going to work, how employers are going to use it, and also to give some feedback and input as to how that's going to work going forward. And in fact, at Arch, we're now part of the pilot and the ongoing pilot for that to test it between now and next year, so that we can make sure it's ready effectively to go when we need it. So what can we spend the levy on? Well, we know it has to be spent on approved apprenticeship training. So it may be that, again, colleagues on the call and the webinar here perhaps have internal training schemes already. Could that be mapped in some way to an apprenticeship? Well, provided we look to work and map that to an approved apprenticeship, either framework or one of the newer standards, then absolutely that's possible for us to do, and something that clearly I'm sure a number of you are already looking into in a lot more depth. So an approved apprenticeship standard or framework with an approved apprenticeship provider. Now again, people on the call here, there is a new concept. It's really, the history that we came from as Arch, an employer provider. There may be people on the webinar here thinking that that's something they would like to look at further, which is where actually they set up within their own business to manage their own levy and their own internal training apprenticeship programs. Clearly there are a number of steps to go through to make that happen, and if people want to know more about that, perhaps that's something we could get into at some other stage. So an approved standard or framework with an approved apprenticeship provider. There'll be a voucher system, so the Digital Apprenticeship Service effectively will be where the money goes via HMRC. Again, more on that in a second. And each month, as apprentices are on programme, withdrawals will be made from that account to the relevant training provider that you're working with, where the apprentice is obviously receiving their training from. So if we move on to the next slide, if we could, Tim, thank you. Really, in August, we were waiting for a number of announcements. So they were expected and anticipated to be in June. Because of what happened with Brexit and the changes in government, there was some delays to that. But effectively on August the 12th, a number of announcements were made. And that's really what we're talking about here. And the first one was a very slight delay to the implementation. And again, some people I think maybe understood this slightly wrong. Effectively, any new apprenticeship start from the 1st of May, we will utilise the levy in order to pay for those apprentices and that apprenticeship training, whereas previously, prior to the announcement, it was going to be anything after the beginning of April. So there's a very slight delay in the implementation of new apprenticeship starts that can be covered for from the levy, and that's the 1st of May. I think that did cause some confusion with some of our employers, because again, some people I was talking to, and I think Ben had a similar experience, were thinking that it was based on their May payroll, which it isn't. And again, companies I've been working with, a bit of a gotcha, maybe that's April's the time of the year they pay their annual bonuses. The May payment that goes into the levy pot will be based upon your April pay bill. So just something to look out for. Again, I think people have seen the 1st of May and assume that's when it starts, but it's the April pay bill that will be looked at to calculate what will go into your account in May. Another thing that's happened is that there are new funding bands. So there were six funding bands we were working with, and all apprenticeships, whether they're standards or frameworks, are mapped against a particular band, or you might hear it referred to as a cap as well, and this is where the government have set a value for what an apprenticeship should be worth. And effectively there were six of those. The lowest band was at £4,000 and the highest was at 27. And one of the new announcements in August was an expansion of those bands. There are now 15 of those, the lowest band being 1,500 and the highest band still being 27,000. And really it's things like the length of the programme, the complexity, the level of the programme, the technical content. There are all sorts of factors taken into account when apprenticeships are designed, and it's the government then that maps them against one of those bands, and effectively that's how much then that apprenticeship will cost per apprentice. Co-investment. So again, new statement from August is around co-investment. So I guess this applies in two different scenarios. One is, what if I'm a non-levy paying customer? What if my pay bill is less than £3 million? How will I be funded for apprentices going forward? And the other, which works exactly the same in fact, is what if I've spent my entire levy pot? What if my 235,000 has gone in, but actually I want to recruit and train more apprentices than that will buy me? So in both of those situations, co-investment applies, which effectively is where the government will pay 90% of the cost of the apprenticeship up to the maximum within the band, and the employer will contribute 10% towards that cost. And again, building on what Ben said, and again, some of the customers I've been talking to are saying to me, we already know we're absolutely going to spend our levy, and in fact, obviously the incentive is there to go above and beyond that and do more, because clearly if the government will put 90% of the cost aside for you to do so, that's really quite an attractive option for you as an employer. So that will come into effect again when the levy does from next year. SMEs, again, there may not be any on the call here with fewer than 50 employees, but if there are, then when it comes to co-investment, actually, if you recruited a 16 to 18-year-old under co-investment and you were less than 50 employees, you wouldn't even have to pay the 10%, 100% of the costs will be paid for by government in that case. There are also additional employer incentives, particularly around some of the younger age range, and that's the next bullet point there, is that what if I was to take a 16 to 18-year-old? Because the way it works at the moment is government incentivises employers to do that because they appreciate there's a little more work involved, perhaps it's their very first job, a little bit less life experience and certainly work experience. So in that situation, for any employer, regardless of size, so even the larger employers, if they recruit somebody aged between 16 and 18 years old, there will be an incentive of £1,000 that goes to them as an employer, and an additional £1,000 that goes to the provider that they're working with, because in both cases they realise there's little more work to do. Effectively, that's paid in two tranches at month 3 and month 12. You get £500 at the end of month 3, or we both would in that case, and then again at the end of the 12th month, the second tranche of that payment would be made. And the final point on that slide is around sort of use it or lose it. This was reconfirmed in August. There will be an 18-month expiry date placed on vouchers. So whatever is paid into that account in May of next year, really by October of 2018, you should be thinking about, have I spent that particular monthly payment that's gone in? Because if you haven't, you will lose that particular amount of money that you haven't as yet spent. So really perhaps important that you're tracking your payments and making sure that you're spending them as you go.
Can I just ask a question on that slide?
Of course, yeah.
I can see that the government is definitely trying to scale up what they're doing with apprentices, but it strikes me that there is additional complexity which is being brought in. You mentioned the bans being introduced, and particularly, whilst I can see the objective for engaging with small and medium enterprises is a good intention, there will be additional complexity there as well. What would be your message to the audience about how they can address that complexity and what they need to learn about preparing for that level of regulation?
I mean, many of the people that came onto the webinar had said that they'd worked with apprentices before, perhaps have apprentices at the moment, and therefore will be working perhaps already with apprenticeship providers. That absolutely would be a place to go to get guidance. Obviously, there's ourselves. We're happy to help out in any way that we possibly can too. Myself and Ben and the rest of the team are here to help guide people through this process. I think in reality though, the system is already pretty complex, Tim, so we say there's additional complexities, but really I guess when we look at how the current system works, I think it's actually going to be far more simple come post-May than it is at the moment, because the way frameworks are funded at the moment versus how standards are funded are very different, and yet going forward they'll be the same. There's all sorts of complexities around age at the moment, and also postcode of where somebody lives. And you'll see some things on the next slide, which really, in lots of ways, the government have actually tried to simplify things post next May, rather than make them more complicated.
Okay,
So I know at the moment it may seem as though there's a lot to take in, but I guess anyone working with apprenticeships really sort of post May next year, it'll be one system, one way of doing things, that'll be far simpler.
Yeah, so it's about getting your head around the new system,
Yes.
and then once you've done that, then it should be relatively simple to maintain.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So on the next slide, Ben kind of touched on this briefly, is around, who can actually benefit from this training? And Ben put it pretty nicely actually. It can be existing workforce as well as your new hires as well. Graduates can now be involved too. The way it stands at the moment is once you've passed year one at university, you can no longer be funded using the apprenticeship system to do so. But clearly going forward, graduates are available to do this. There is something there around substantive new skills, and it'd be interesting, the Institute for Apprenticeships will kind of police this and how this is going to work. But some of the examples that we've had with some of our employers is that perhaps for digital marketing, they may have somebody who's been to university and studied philosophy or history or law or whatever, but now wants to work within a digital environment. Clearly that's substantive new skills, and you could argue that a level 3 advanced apprenticeship or level 4 higher apprenticeship is absolutely okay for that young person to go on and be funded for using the levy to do so. Whereas perhaps if you had already studied marketing at university and then wanted to work within a marketing environment, you would need to do something at a higher level than the current qualification that you hold. So one of the things that the government are working with universities on at the moment are also looking at creating master's level apprenticeships, so you get to full masters as well. So for those people with a degree in marketing, they would perhaps to work towards an apprenticeship standard at master's level, which is higher than something they've already got. And it talks a little bit about that on the slide there. One of the things that also was clarified in August was around supply chain. A lot of employers, and I was with one just the other day, in fact, I won't say who, but they were saying to me, they know that they won't spend all of their levy, but they have really quite a good relationship with a lot of their supply chain and would like to determine where their unspent levy goes. So at the moment, after 18 months, if you've not used it, the money will be taken and will be given to someone else, and you won't have a choice in who that goes to. But clearly using this system, if you were to wish to do so, if there was a part of your supply chain that were also using the digital apprenticeship service, then there is no reason why you couldn't look to give up to 10% of your unspent, your levy away to that supply chain. That is actually under consultation at the moment, so it may be that figure changes, but as it stands today, it's talking about that being a 10% figure.
Yeah.
There are further announcements, as I mentioned, in October and December. In fact, just in literally the last couple of days, the October announcements, we've heard a little more that they might be a little later than anticipated. So we were expecting something probably around the third week in October, but actually I think by all the announcements I've seen in the last 2 to 3 days, that's looking like now at the end of October, maybe even fall into November. So there are certain things that we're waiting to hear, and we'll do so shortly. The next slide really gives some examples, so just to make sure people kind of understand where we're at. So the first one, actually, a company with 120 employees, their pay bill is £2.7 million a year. 0.5% of that is only £13,500. If you actually looked at your allowance, this particular customer would not actually pay into the levy pot at all. They would fall under co-investment, which is where the government, for any apprentice they took, the government will pay essentially 90% of it, or £9 for every pound that the employer pays into that particular apprenticeship program. The next example is a larger employer, 5,000 employees, and that's on the next slide, 10, where we have someone with a pay bill of £150 million, which a levy payment would be £750,000. minus the allowance means 735,000 would go into the pot. If I assume that all of those people were employed in England, then that would be topped up by 10%, 73,500 by government too, which means £808,500 available to spend on apprenticeship training. Naturally, if some of that spend was in Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland, you'd only get the 10% top up on your English portion of that 750,000.
Could you give us an idea of how many apprentices roughly? I know that the costs will vary, but what does 808,000 relate to?
It really does come down to those bands, Tim, and the type of apprentice. So some of the degree level apprenticeships and some of the high level, sort of level 4 higher apprenticeships we're working on are funded at £27,000. So we could divide that by 27,000 and eat it up sort of fairly quickly. Whereas some of the lower level ones, funded down at £4,000, clearly you're going to have to take 6 to 7 times as many apprentices to spend the same amount of money.
In our sector, when we're talking to employers, we tend to use a rule of thumb. But this is for digital and IT, so if you're looking at programming on digital and IT, this won't be so relevant, but around £10,000 a year is the rule of thumb. So if you take the degree apprenticeship, that's over 3 years. So it's, give or take a bit, that's £10,000 a year. And similarly, a level 3 advanced apprenticeship, which may be 12 months or a little over 12 months, it's going to be around 10 or maybe a little bit more. And then a level 4, which is 18 months or 2 years, will be perhaps 15 or 18,000 pounds. So give or take a bit for our sector, around 10,000 pounds per year per apprenticeship. So for 800,000 pounds, we're talking about 80 apprenticeships in any one time on programme.
Yeah, great. Thank you both for clarifying that. I think it was just useful for the audience to get a bit of a feel for that.
No, great. And then the next slide is around, well, what can I use it to do? So obviously the levy pot can be used for the following things. So obviously apprenticeship training and assessment, working with a provider like ourselves, or whether you're doing it internally. But obviously an assessment organisation, we work with people like BCS or City and Girls or EdXL Pearson, etc. Work with lots of those people too. And we mentioned towards an approved apprenticeship standard or framework with an approved provider. There's a new register coming, the Register of Approved Training Providers, which someone has to be on in order to be an approved provider, and obviously that's you have to be on that list for sure, up to the maximum funding band as well. In engineering, we have some colleagues who work in engineering where the band may be set at a certain value, but actually they may have already had an arrangement with an employer where they fund more than that. Perhaps some additionalities in there too. It's obviously up to the maximum that the band is set at. So if you decide and work with a provider to do more, it may be that there's additional cost to that for you. What it can't be used to do is pay the wages. So obviously you have a wage cost for the apprentice themselves. They're working for you as an employee. Naturally you have to pay their wages still, as well as things like travel costs, managerial time, any other thing to do really around the apprenticeship with regards to, if you're thinking of setting up an internal apprenticeship program, for instance, you can't use the levy in order to do so. The levy really is ring-fenced for the apprentice themselves, for their certification, training, assessment, whether that's on and off the job. Okay. There are some just examples of funding bands. So you asked me there the question about sort of what would that get you. So there's some examples of some of the things we're doing in our sector. You can see here software developer at level 4. Typically that's a 24-month program. That will be funded in band 12 of the 15 at £18,000. But as Ben rightly says, if that's really £9,000 a year, isn't it? If you look at that as £18,000 across 24 months. And there are various examples there for someone to have a look at. Clearly, there is a link that we can provide to the where essentially on the government website it lists all the apprenticeship frameworks and standards that exist, and it tells you where their proposed banding sits. Now, just a little caveat on that before I move on, and that's those bands aren't fixed yet. So they went in effectively a couple of months ago, and there was a consultation period where people could respond to say whether they thought that they'd been put in the right brackets or the incorrect ones, and to put a case together for changing them. And so effectively there are some of those I know that are being looked at, and it may be that the final band, which was going to be confirmed in October for every one of them, it may be that they fall into a different band in the future, but that's where they sit today. And I've got obviously lots of time for questions, so that's really for now all I wanted to go through, Tim.
Great. Well, thank you, Jason. That was great to really get into the detail there and understand the way it's actually going to work, the mechanisms of how it would be implemented. Ben, would you like to maybe just kind of talk us through what our audience should be thinking about as next steps moving forward now?
Yeah, so while if you're putting together some questions for us, this is how we're working with people, the steps we're working through to help them prepare for May next year. So the first thing is to understand how you're actually going to manage this, your internal infrastructure. So who's going to be your point person or point people? Who are the key stakeholders who need to be brought together? Lots of people we're working with are putting together some sort of steering group or oversight group or program board, whatever you prefer to call it, with a person who is a day-to-day charged with drawing that together and making sure that it all happens. I think it's then worth thinking about, well, what are the other resources that are required to deliver this? Do you have trainers internally? Do you have people who could be assessors internally, or are you going to have to work with someone externally? Or what's the blend going to be? So working out your kind of infrastructure and resources, not least because you'll need those people during the planning process to help you understand and pull together a plan that does make sensible use of your levy. The next thing, this stage 3 on the slide that we've got up, is go back to it's not about using up the levy, it's about making sure the levy is a tool to help you deliver the skills and productivity that you want. So going back to fundamentals, what skills does the business need? Where are the skills shortages? Which are the people what are the skills that are hard to hire or hard to develop or hard to retain? And think about those as the places where you might deploy your apprenticeship levy most productively. And having got a view of that, you then say, well, what apprenticeship programs are there out there? Because there are lots that are available now, but there are many more in development, and it may be that the programs that you're able to deploy in the first year of the levy may be a small subset of what you eventually end up using as new standards come on stream. So look at the existing ones, work out which are most attractive, but don't despair if actually they don't appear to be the right programs for you. There is a process, a way of getting involved to help develop new standards, but certainly need to be looking at what's there here and now to use the levy from May next year. And then I think there are these 2 streams then, which are these final steps 5 and 6. So yes, you can go out and hire new people into the business. That's a sort of the traditional model of apprenticeship programs, build a program for school leavers. But actually you can extend it for other new hires, including graduates, as we've now discussed, but also looking at the people who you're just hiring as part of your natural churn or growth. A number of those people who you're hiring into the business are likely to be at the early stages of their career. They might be second or third jobbers. And actually you can build a program for them that both excites them, engages them, and helps ensure that they get the skills quickly and systematically and methodically that you want them to have as well. So that's the new hires. And then of course looking at your existing workforce, particularly in a world in which as digital technology seems to take over everything, there are a bunch of job roles that are no longer relevant, but there may be people in those roles who you really value as employees, who know the business inside out, and actually what would be great is if you could find a way of re-skilling them for new roles as the economy fundamentally changes, and certainly apprenticeship programs are fantastic for doing that, or if you've got women returners or other programs that you want to build systematic skills across your workforce. So think about it in those 2 kind of streams. And then, what we're doing is we're putting together great big spreadsheets with our employers and mapping out all of those possibilities and beginning to just populate those with potential numbers. And it just seems to give people a nice sense of structure and calmness about working out where they can use their apprenticeship levy in ways that will really make a difference to the business, as opposed to just using up as much of the levy as possible. So those are the steps we've been going through, Tim, with lots of our employers.
Great, well thanks very much, Ben. I'm going to open it up for questions in a minute. Thank you everybody who's contributing questions. I can see them coming into the question box, so if you've been thinking about a question, now is the time. What I would also like to say is that clearly Arch has a great deal of experience of working with clients to answer a lot of the questions which you probably have, and although we've covered it at a very high level or a generic level today, our team here would be happy to spend some time with you as a thank you for attending the webinar. They would spend some time with you to talk through your individual circumstances. So If you would like to find out more, you can have a more in-depth chat. I've put up a couple of contact details there for Jason and Ben, showing their email addresses out there. And you can also go to archapprenticeships.co.uk and call 020 8080 9553 to speak to us and find out more. Okay, so I'm going to turn off the slides now, and you can see us again. I know we can go between the two of them. And I'm going to go on to the questions now and just go through some of these. I'll probably do a couple of them at the same time if we can, starting at the most recent. Jenna has said, how can we combine existing employer-sponsored education qualifications with the new standards to utilise the levy? And I'm just conscious of time. I'll probably try and do two at the same time, and then if I can get Ben and Jason to respond to them quickly. Is there a set salary for apprentices, or is this flexible for all employers? So Ben,
I'll start with the easy one, which is the salary one, which is the answer is no. There is no, certainly no maximum. There is a minimum wage which applies to apprentices, which is now
£3.40.
£3.40 an hour. But that's for apprentices who are 18 or under, or in the first year of their apprenticeship. It goes up from there. We can circulate the link to the official side of things. But in our experience, if you pay at the bottom end of apprenticeships in terms of that salary scale, you're likely to get a very small pool of candidates coming forward. We're in, all of our jobs are in sort of city centres, and we recommend a minimum of £10,000 in London per annum and £8,000 outside of London. But of course, if you're putting existing employees onto an apprenticeship program, or you already have a pay scale for, say, a graduate program, it's up to you how you do that. We wouldn't recommend that you reduce someone's salary in order that they go on an apprenticeship. You certainly don't have to. There's absolutely no expectation around that. So I hope that helps answer that question.
Thanks. And Jason, the question about how can we combine existing employer-sponsored education with the new standards?
I guess, one of the first things we should do clearly is look at how do your current qualifications, certifications map to a standard that already exists. So we'll send out a link that perhaps gives you a list of where all the standards are, and you can see the ones that already have been created. But it'd really be working with someone, an organisation perhaps like ourselves then, to look at, well, actually, is there a way that perhaps that training could be mapped within an apprenticeship standard? So, we have sister companies that have, programs that run at Avado, for instance. They run the We Are Squared program on behalf of Google. And one of the things that we've done is look to, well, how do we take that certification and map that in some way in some of the apprenticeships that we do, so that not only do they get their apprenticeship and the qualification they need to get as part of the approved standard, they also get to cover off some of the things that the employer may also need with some training that they're doing already. Yeah. So again, the other things in our standards, again in our sector, we've done things with the likes of Microsoft and CompTIA and Cisco, where their certifications have been mapped into our standards too, and perhaps form part of the apprenticeship itself. The apprenticeship standard really is kind of a 2-page document that says this is what a person should be able to do once the apprenticeship is finished. And it's a whole list of criteria around competencies effectively. If someone is competent in all these things by the end, then they are a network engineer or a cyber security specialist or whatever it may be. So it's really a case of taking some of that existing training you do, mapping it within that to make sure that we can utilise it as part of the apprenticeship standard.
Great, thank you. Probably time for a couple more questions, so I'm going to work through those. One of them, which has come up a number of times, is will you be sharing the slides? Yes, we'll be sharing a recording of the entire webinar with everybody who has attended, so will that be sent out later with the slides in there as well. Mm-hmm. The question from Ross is, what happens if your wage bill is over the limit 1 year, you take on an apprentice under the levy rules, but your wage bill drops below the threshold the following year? And I'll take a second question there from Emma, which is, can I check that you were saying we will need to contribute above the max cap funding for an apprenticeship, i.e. 30k, when the cap is 27? Am I correct that the additional monies cannot come from the levy? Okay.
Yeah, so if I take both of those, that's okay. I'll take the second one first. So yes, if you had an arrangement with your training organisation where the cost of the apprenticeship was 30,000, if that had been mapped against a band at 27, you could only use £27,000 of your levy towards the cost of that apprenticeship. As an aside to that, you'd have to have an arrangement with your training provider to pay them the additional £3,000 that you've agreed to pay them, which would not be able to be used from within your levy funds. So that is absolutely right, yes. And then the second question was around what the first question, sorry, what happens if I am sort of in the threshold to pay the levy at some point and not at other points? Well, in fact, this is quite an interesting one because it's done month by month. So effectively, it will look at your pay bill in a particular month and calculate 0.5% of it. Your allowance is also spread over 12 months. Your £1,250 a month adds up to your £15,000 allowance. So what it will do is it will look each month at should you be paying this month or shouldn't you? And if you should, you obviously pay into the pot, and if you shouldn't, then you won't. I guess the real complicating factor is where then across a year, as the question asked, you know, what happens if I've taken on an apprentice and I know the cost of that apprenticeship is £12,000, but over the year I only end up putting £4,000 into the pot, as an example, because some months I paid it and some months I didn't have to. I was right on the cusp. In those situations, in fact, the difference between the two would come under co-investment. So in those situations, it may be that you take on an apprentice, and on occasions you have sufficient money in your levy pot to pay that monthly instalment to the training provider, and in other months it may be you have to do something separate as part of co-investment, where the government pays 90% and you pay the 10%. That will become really quite complicated for those people right on the cusp of paying.
Okay, I think probably just a couple more here. We've just got probably about a minute or so. How does the calculation work for group companies? Is it PAYE combined for each limited company? And I suppose it's the entity through which you are paid on your payroll that it comes down to. Is that right?
That's right.
So it's actually done on if you are classed as linked companies by HMRC, then you have one allowance to share between you. So we work with a lot of media companies who are some of the biggest media companies in the world, who have groups within groups, sometimes within groups, and actually they are going to be allowed just one allowance of £15,000, i.e. they'll be paying a levy on the whole of the payroll within their companies, even though some of those entities are very small because they're linked companies. However, groups within the groups will be able to manage their levy. They'll have a bit of the account, their own kind of sub-account on the digital apprenticeship service, which means that they can manage that. But in terms of what the government absolutely wanted to stop happening was lots of companies breaking themselves up into entities where the payroll was £2,999,999 and thereby avoiding it. So they invoked the same rules that apply to linked companies for other purposes in order to avoid that. So if you are part of a group where the ownership is the same, then even if you're under 3 million, your payroll will be included in the overall group's apprenticeship levy.
And related to that, it has to be the final question, but I know we often get questions from people outside of England within the United Kingdom. Question from Ross McRae is, how do you manage government contributions if you have staff in Scotland, England and Northern Ireland? Jason, do you do that?
Yeah, so the systems for that are still also being established. So the government, I guess, are focused at the moment on the English system, the digital apprenticeship service, and the 10% top-up that applies in England. One of the things that was clarified in August was, how do I know if effectively an employee is an English or a Scottish employee? Now, the way it works today is it's based on the postcode of where you live, but actually going forward from the levy, it's based on the postcode of where you work. So you may have a situation where somebody actually lives in England but works across the border in Scotland. It's their employer's address where their workplace is that will determine that they therefore fall under the Scottish system rather than the English one.
Yeah, great. Thank you particularly for the short and concise answers to those last questions. I'd very much like to thank everybody who's taken part in this audience. We're going to have to wrap up the Q&A session now. But as I say, there's an opportunity there to continue the conversation with Arch. So if you'd like to take us up on that opportunity, please do get in touch with the email addresses. We'll be sending a follow-up email with a full recording of the webinar. And I would very much encourage you to share that with your colleagues and friends in the industry and of course any other businesses as well. We mentioned before about the importance of sharing, the possibility of sharing that levy with your whole supply chain. So please do share this. It's affecting all businesses with over 3 million payroll. So please do also follow us on social media. I hope you've found today's webinar useful and you've learned how the apprenticeship levy will be impacting upon your business. So that's it from me. I'd like to thank Ben Rowland and Jason Moss very much, and I'd in particular really like to thank you, the audience, for some great questions, and I hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.